All right, everyone. Now we're going to go on to our next topic, which is the Union dividing. And with this topic, we're going to look a lot at something called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And, we talked previously about how there was a compromise in place. It looked like the country would survive. But man, just this decade, the 1850s, just one thing after another. That's causing the country to really fall apart. Okay, so the architect of the Kansas-Nebraska Act is a gentleman named Stephen A. Douglas. You can see him here on our picture, bottom left of our slide. Standing at about 4'8", Stephen Douglas is a congressman from Illinois. He's a Democratic congressman from Illinois. And Douglas just really believed that America's future lay to the West. He really believed that America was destined to become a great country, but that in order for us to become that great country, we really needed people to move out to the West. We could get more states, get at the resources in the land, and things like that. So Douglas is looking for incentives or ways to try to get people to head out west. This is really that era of head west, young men, if you will. Well, one thing that Douglas knew could help westward migration of America was the railroad trains. Uh, if you could get a track going from the East Coast to the West Coast, it'd be easier for people to travel out to the West. So Douglas was really big on building what's called a transcontinental railroad, a railroad that would span from the East Coast to the West Coast, connecting the country, if you will. So Douglas is big on the idea that the country needs to commit itself to building a transcontinental railroad. Truth be told, at that point, most politicians agreed with Douglas's assessment. The country really did need a transcontinental railroad. We needed something that could connect the East Coast to the West Coast and all points in between. But the question at that point in time, say early to mid 1850s, was where should that train go? Like what should be. Wow, sorry, my dog just went crazy. Somebody was knocking on our front door. All right, let's get back to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Okay, so yeah, there's no question the country needs that transcontinental railroad. The question is, where should it go? There was some talk that Memphis, Tennessee could be the location, that you could get a train going from, say, New York, cut through to Memphis, Tennessee, and then swing on out to San Francisco, California. There was also talk of St. Louis, Missouri, maybe being that terminus of the railroad. But really, the two big ideas at that time, one of them was New Orleans, Louisiana, and the other one was Chicago, Illinois. Let me deal with the other three first, and then I'll look at the talk of New Orleans, Louisiana. Okay, the problem with the other three locations that most politicians said was you're going to have to go across the Rocky Mountains if you go that way. They're pretty steep, they're pretty big. If you go from Chicago heading out west, you'll cross the Great Plains, that's true, but eventually you'll get off into sort of modern day Colorado, Utah. You're going to have to cross some mountains there. If you go through St. Louis or Memphis, the same thing happens there. But New Orleans was actually the location that got the most support at that time. You could go through the port mouth of the Mississippi. From there, you could go through Texas, go through the pass at El Paso. In fact, there's that little purchase out there in the American Southwest. It's called the Gadsden Purchase. Don't get too worked up about this, but the country actually purchased that area known as the Gadsden Purchase because we figured that this was going to be the Transcontinental Railroad going from New York down to New Orleans, and then from New Orleans through Texas, the pass at El Paso, on through the Gadsden Purchase, on through Southern California, and eventually make its way on up to San Francisco, California. It had the most support because, number one, it would have been the safest route. If you're going up there through Chicago, St. Louis, and you cross through the Great Plains, you'll come into contact with the Great Plains Indians, and they don't really like seeing the white man come through their part of the world. They really won't like seeing what they call the Iron Horse come through their part of the world. So you've got the the tribes of the Great Plains are a little more hostile, whereas those down in the New Mexico territory, they're not as hostile as up in the Great Plains. So it's a little bit safer. Also, you completely cut out the Rocky Mountains. You don't have to go through any of that. It's more flat. It's more safe. It could be built quicker for a cheaper amount of money. So yeah, the push for the first transcontinental railroad really was that New Orleans would be the location. Also, the idea was, the Mississippi is that powerful highway, and farmers out to the west could use the Mississippi to get down to New Orleans. From there, those things, their crops and things could travel to San Francisco or New York. Kind of just depends on which way you want to go. Anyway, I guess my point is this. New Orleans was the site that most people were pushing for at that time. Well, for Douglas, New Orleans just doesn't work. He wants the Transcontinental Railroad to go through Chicago. He's from Illinois, so that means he can bring some jobs home to his state. It's called bringing home the bacon. Politicians are all about bringing home money, jobs, support to their home states. That helps them in their re-election campaigns, And as a senator from Illinois, he wants he wants to go back to the United States Senate. So one thing he could do is bring jobs, bring this Transcontinental Railroad to his home state of Illinois. Another truth is Douglas owns some of the land along the prescribed route coming out of Chicago. So he himself stood to make a bit of a profit if the government were to choose the Chicago location. My point is this: Douglas is putting himself first and America second. That's very un-George Washington of him. That's very un-Henry Clay of him. This guy really was a nationalist. He really did love our country. He really did want to see it expand and grow and succeed. But in these moments, he was being very selfish in wanting the Transcontinental Railroad to go through Chicago rather than New Orleans. So Douglas made a deal with the devil to try to get politicians to pick Chicago instead of New Orleans. And his deal with the devil is the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Here's how he's going to sell it, and here's how it plays. If they will choose Chicago as the terminus of the Transcontinental Railroad, if it goes through the city of Chicago, then he says what we'll do is we'll take the remainder of the Louisiana Purchase, what bit of it is left out there, it's unorganized, and out of that land we're going to create the Kansas and Nebraska territories. So we'll create two new territories out west. One we'll call Kansas, the other we'll call Nebraska. And he said we're going to let popular sovereignty decide the issue of slavery in Kansas and Nebraska. So if Chicago can be the location of the Transcontinental Railroad, we're going to create two new territories. One is Kansas, the other is Nebraska. And we're going to let popular sovereignty decide the issue of slavery in Kansas and Nebraska. All right, well, this deal with the devil is a bit of a problem because the land in question, Kansas and Nebraska territories, that is north of 3630. And there was a Missouri Compromise, if you'll recall, that stated any territories north of 3630 are free soil. Any territories south of are set aside for slavery. So this will violate the Missouri Compromise. It'll violate the 3630 line if it's passed, if it comes to be. Now, the Missouri Compromise was an act of Congress signed by a president, and you can undo that with another act of Congress signed by a president. So legally speaking, he can pull this off. It can be done. The question at that point is, could he get the votes to pull it off, to undo that 3630 line? Well, let's see. At this point, we have Democrats, we have Whigs. Some are from the North, some are from the South. So let's look at how those four groups reacted to this legislation, this idea of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Let's see. Let's start by looking at, let's look at Southern Whigs. Let's start there. Southern Whigs were on board with this idea. In fact, Southern Whigs and Southern Democrats together said, so hold on just a second. You're telling me if we make Chicago the location of the Transcontinental Railroad, you're going to give slavery a chance where it never had a chance before? Douglas says, yes, sir. If the Kansas-Nebraska Act passes, if Chicago's the location, then I'm going to give slavery a chance in Kansas and Nebraska north of 3630. And Southern Democrats and Southern Whigs together said, well, I don't know what the heck I was thinking. Chicago would make a great location for a transcontinental railroad. Forget about New Orleans. We're going to have a chance for slavery north of 3630. Yes, sir, that's what I'm saying. All right, fine then, sign me up. I'm all about this Kansas-Nebraska Act. So all of the South's politicians said yes to the idea of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Northern Democrats had a bit of a problem with this, but Douglas basically told Northern Democrats this is a party line vote. And he said, I'm calling out party loyalty on this one. If you vote no for the Kansas-Nebraska Act, then you can stop calling yourself a Democrat. So he kind of bullied Northern Democrats into voting yes for it. And also, Northern Democrats understood their power base was the South. They understood that in campaigns to come, they would need Southern votes in elections. So they got enough Northern Democrats to support it to matter, that it would pass, that it would come to be. Truth be told, the only group that opposed the Kansas-Nebraska Act were Northern Whigs. Northern Whigs didn't like it. He couldn't control them in any way, you know. So Northern Whigs, of all the voting blocks here, they're the only ones that did not support the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So we got Northern Democrats, at least enough to matter, along with all of the South. Couldn't do anything really about those Northern Whigs. They were out of his control. But with that, the Kansas-Nebraska Act will pass the House. It'll pass the Senate. It then goes on to the desk of the President of the United States, where Franklin Pierce is looking at this and saying, boy, I don't know. This will undo the Missouri Compromise. You know, all that land out there to the north of 3630 has always been set aside as free soil. Well, it's tough. I just don't know what to do. And he asked, what do we do, Jeff Davis, my most trusted advisor, Secretary of War? Lean on you here for your information. And Jefferson Davis said, well, you know, Mr. President, Chicago make a fine location for a transcontinental railroad. I think you got to go ahead and sign on that on into law. So it passes the Congress. It's signed into reality by President Franklin Pierce. So he pulled it off. He did it. Douglas got his Kansas-Nebraska Act passed. Chicago will be the terminus of the Transcontinental Railroad. And the newly created Kansas and Nebraska territories will allow for popular sovereignty to decide the issue of slavery out there. So in other words, the deal with the devil is slavery now has a chance north of 3630, where previously it had no chance at all. Well, shortly after the law takes effect, some big dominoes begin to fall, and this thing has a massive impact on politics in the United States. Shortly after passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Whig Party is essentially destroyed. Northern Whigs and Southern Whigs fall apart. Their disagreement on this issue really just drove a wedge that couldn't be healed. So Northern Whigs were sort of partyless for a little bit. They joined something called the Know-Nothings. Don't worry about them. Southern Whigs at that point just sort of recognized that the Democratic Party is in the South and it's here to stay. So Southern Whigs became Democrats. Northern Whigs sort of were without a party for just a minute or two. But the Kansas-Nebraska Act, one of its first big outcomes is the destruction of the Whig Party. By the way, you might want to be writing this stuff down, putting a star, smiley face, a rainbow by all of this. Not just what the Kansas-Nebraska Act called for, but what happens because of the Kansas-Nebraska Act as well. Okay, well, kind of out of the ashes of what had been the Whig Party, there would eventually emerge this thing calling itself the Republican Party. The Republican Party was founded in Wisconsin in 1854 out of opposition to the Kansas-Nebraska Act and out of opposition towards Stephen Douglas. This is today's Republican Party that's born here in 1854. I mentioned previously in our semester that the Democratic Party was born out of anger. Remember, Jackson got mad at Adams and Clay. breaks off and forms his own Democratic Party. Well, this Republican Party is also born out of anger, anger over the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and anger at Stephen Douglas. So the Republican Party is born out of this Kansas-Nebraska Act. This Republican Party will oppose Kansas-Nebraska. It will also oppose the expansion of slavery out west into the territories. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act destroys the Whig Party, leads to the creation of the Republican Party, and it also had another impact. It got Abraham Lincoln energized to get back into politics. I'll talk a little bit more about Lincoln before this topic is over with. But you know, Lincoln at this point, 1854, he's out of politics. He's just simply a lawyer in Springfield, Illinois. But he was so angered by this. He was so angry at Douglas, who's from his home state of Illinois. He's angry at passage of the law. The Kansas-Nebraska Act also re-energized Abraham Lincoln to get back into politics. That matters because, I don't know, he goes on to be a two-term president of the United States. And in the eyes of many, he might be the greatest president that the country's ever had. So the fallout from the Kansas-Nebraska Act is the Missouri Compromise is undone. Slavery now has a chance north of 3630 in Kansas and Nebraska, thanks to popular sovereignty. The Whig Party is destroyed, the Republican Party is born, and Abraham Lincoln gets re-energized to get back into politics. Okay, another outcome of the Kansas-Nebraska Act is this episode known as Bleeding Kansas. Bleeding Kansas was the troubles that erupted out in Kansas shortly after passage of the law. Kansas became sort of the test ground for popular sovereignty. There are a lot of people who started moving to Kansas to be there to cast that vote either for or against slavery, right? Because the whole point of popular sovereignty is people living there decide whether or not they'll allow slavery. So a lot of people started heading to Kansas either to vote for slavery or to vote against it. One guy who got wrapped up in this fight is Henry Ward Beecher. On our bottom row of all these men, these photographs, he's the one on the far left. Henry Ward Beecher is a preacher man. He's in Boston, and he's the pastor of a big old church in Boston, Massachusetts. By the way, his church in Boston it really is probably one of the biggest churches in all of America at this point. So this is a big church that he presides over. He's kind of an influential man there in Boston. He also happens to be the son of Lyman Beecher and the brother of Harriet Beecher Stowe, the lady who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. This is her brother here. Well, Henry Ward Beecher was an abolitionist, like his father, like his sister. And Henry Ward Beecher called upon his congregation in Boston to pony up some money, to pass around that offering plate and step up and provide some cash. Because Henry Ward Beecher told his congregation that they were going to pay for young families, young men and women, to move out to Kansas and to be there in Kansas to cast that vote against slavery when the chance arose. So he's calling upon abolitionists in his church, and really those who oppose slavery, period, in his church, to put together the money that they're going to need to buy wagons, supplies, and pay for these families to move out to Kansas and to be there to cast that popular sovereignty vote against slavery. The church did pony up a lot of cash, and Henry Ward Beecher did pay for families, wagons, horses, everything they needed to move out to that Kansas territory and to be there to cast that vote against slavery. By the way, later when Kansas started to bleed, when warfare broke out, Henry Ward Beecher called upon his church followers to pony up some more money. And he used that money to buy rifles. And he sent rifles out to Kansas so that those who opposed slavery would have weapons to defend themselves and to fight back. Those rifles would arrive out in the Kansas territory. Somebody would take the top off of one of the boxes and hand a guy a rifle and say, "There's a Beecher Bible. Go spread the gospel across Kansas, brother," is what they'd say. So yeah, that's kind of fascinating that a religious leader is buying weapons for people to use. Well, Southerners were also trying to convince people to move west as well. And step into our story, Mr. David Atchison. He comes to us from the state of Missouri, which is right next door to Kansas. And David Atchison, a U.S. Senator from Missouri, was calling upon young Southern men to also head west, to move to Kansas, and to be there when it came time to cast that vote to support slavery there in the territory. So we got religious leaders getting involved, we got politicians getting involved, and they're trying to convince people to move to Kansas, to be there either to oppose slavery or defend it when the time came. The people who tended to go to Kansas, they tended to be extreme. There weren't a lot of moderate people headed to Kansas at that time. They either really, really hated slavery or they really, really supported slavery. But you didn't find too many moderates in Kansas at that time. A lot of hotheads were headed that way. Maybe the hottest of those heads belonged to Mr. John Brown. Bottom row of photographs, the guy in the middle. John Brown was a hardcore abolitionist. In fact, he might have been the most radical and hardcore of the abolitionists. John Brown dedicated his life to the destruction of slavery. And there's a scene where John Brown, earlier in his life, was in a church in Ohio, near Cincinnati, Ohio. A preacher man was preaching that Sunday morning. And at some point, John Brown stood up and interrupted the sermon. He's kind of standing in the back of the church, and he asked for everyone's attention. And John Brown told those that gathering at the church that he was an angel sent to the Lord by God, and that God had sent him as an angel to the earth for the purposes of destroying slavery in the United States. Now, I can imagine if you had been sitting there in the church that morning, you probably would have looked at the guy like he was a little bit on the crazy side. And truth be told, if you look at John Brown's family tree, there are several instances of people who had some mental health issues. But John Brown believed himself to be an angel of the Lord, and he really believed that his purpose on this world was to eradicate slavery from the United States. So John Brown decided to come to Kansas. He's with his third wife. The other two died childbirth, giving birth to children. He's on his third wife. He's got 18 kids, and the whole Brown clan is moving out to Kansas. And not only is he there to cast that vote when the time is right to oppose slavery, but some of his sons are old enough that they too can cast votes when the time is right in opposition to slavery. Right, so we've got self-proclaimed angels heading out to Kansas. We've got some extreme people headed out that way. And to fast forward our story just a little bit, in the spring of 1855, it came time for people living in Kansas, the territory of Kansas, to cast that popular sovereignty vote. They were asked to either vote for or against the institution of slavery in the Kansas territory. They held the election over several days. You got to understand, back then there were farmers. You got to give these people time to come into town and do all that sort of stuff. But eventually the votes are all tallied up. And when they figure it all out, by an overwhelming majority, Kansas votes to be a slave territory. So Kansas votes pro-slavery, and it ain't even close. By a mile, Kansas is voted to be a slave territory under popular sovereignty. But then those in charge of the vote started to look at it a little closer. Something didn't quite make sense. Because it turned out there were more people who voted for slavery in Kansas than there were human beings living in Kansas. And it became pretty quick, pretty fast that the fix was in. Don't really have a map pulled up, sorry about that, but Missouri is right next to Kansas. Arkansas borders are too. And what happened was a lot of people from Missouri and Arkansas crossed over the state lines, went into the Kansas territory with forged papers, and started voting for slavery as though they themselves lived in Kansas as well. They stuck around for the barbecues and dances and then headed on back home to Missouri and Arkansas, feeling like they'd done their part for the institution of slavery. So it's obvious the fix is in. It's obvious that something wrong has taken place here. But the vote itself is sent back to Washington, D.C. It goes before the Committee on the Territories in front of the United States Senate. And who should chair the Committee on the Territories in the United States Senate but Stephen A. Douglas himself? And Douglas, in these moments, again, he wants his railroad. He wants people to move west. It's like really in his own personal life, he didn't have a moral objection to slavery. And Douglas, in looking at this election result, says, well, okay, you may account for some fraud taking place here, but it's pretty obvious that the people living in Kansas want slavery. The majority of them do anyways. So Douglas's Senate committee rubber stamps the election as the dumbest thing they ever did. They should have kicked it back and said, hey, do it again, do it right this time. But no, they'll endorse the fraudulent vote. Then it goes before the President of the United States for his consideration. Franklin Pierce is looking at it and says, boy, I don't know here. We got more people voting for slavery than we have people in Kansas. It's a tough call. What do we do here, Jeff Davis, my most trusted advisor? And Jeff Davis says, well, you know, it's not our fault. People in Kansas don't know how to vote. It's pretty obvious to me that the majority of Kansans want slavery. Why don't you go ahead and sign that on into law there, Mr. President? So on the advice of Jefferson Davis, President Pierce will rubber stamp it as well. So you have a territory out west that, from a government perspective, U.S. government perspective, is pro-slavery. But for people on the ground back in Kansas, they cannot accept this outcome. They cannot accept the fraud. And that's why Kansas started to bleed in the summer of 1855. This guerrilla warfare broke out. Bleeding Kansas was just literally this fight in Kansas between abolitionists and those who supported slavery. And like for real, by the time the U.S. Army got there in force to stop the fighting, more than 250 people were dead in Kansas as a result of this war that broke out. What really happened here in Kansas was a microcosm of what was to come. Some people say the Civil War started here in Kansas in the summer of 1855. I disagree because the war wasn't back east. It was just there in Kansas. But you cannot deny that this was a little sort of a civil war that broke out, a microcosm, if you will, of what was to come. Well, when the fighting broke out, John Brown in particular carried out some pretty interesting things. John Brown and a handful of his followers decided to go to a sleepy little section of Kansas that was known for slaveholding. It's called the Pottawatomie Massacre. You can look up how to spell Pottawatomie. I ain't even going to try. But anyways, John Brown and a handful of his followers go to this region called Pottawatomie, Kansas. And what they did that evening was they dragged these slaveholders out of their homes, held them down in the front yard of their property, and like their wives are screaming, their kids are waking up screaming, watching everything unfold. And while men held that slaveholder down, John Brown stood over these guys and started reciting some weird things. People said he had a crazy look in his eye. He was talking about demons and all this sort of stuff. And then while those slaveholding men were held down, John Brown took a machete and hacked their heads off right there in front of their families in their front yards. They carried that act out 5 times that night there in Pottawatomie, Kansas, hacking off people's heads. When the military showed up, they had some questions they wanted to ask of John Brown. John Brown knew the Army was after him, and he knew that if they got a hold of him, it'd probably just be a handful of questions and then hanging from a tree for murder. So John Brown lit out of Kansas. He took off. He left a woman in the Kansas Territory with a whole bunch of kids. John Brown went running back to the east. He didn't stop running until he got all the way back to Massachusetts. He ends up in Boston, where some abolitionist friends will hide him out. He'll sleep in basements and attics for a little bit. He's on the FBI's most wanted list. For real, he is absolutely a wanted man all across the United States. But John Brown's going to have some years to hide out, reflect on life and its greater meaning, think about things, grow a really spectacular beard, and in the process come up with a plan for the destruction of slavery in the United States. We're not done with John Brown, not by a mile. He's going to go on to carry out a crazy plan at a place called Harper's Ferry, Virginia. If I can give you a crazy little side note to that. So John Brown believes he's an angel sent by the Lord to destroy slavery. All right. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry that happens later on down the road. Many people point to that and argue that's why the Civil War started. That crazy scheme that John Brown tried to pull off there in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. So John Brown's raid, in a sense, starts the U.S. Civil War. The U.S. Civil War ultimately destroys slavery. So in a very strange roundabout way, this guy did fulfill his prophecy. But anyways, we'll get back to Brown a little later on in our class. All right, so we got heads getting hacked off in Kansas. We got warfare breaking out. Meanwhile, back east in the United States Congress, violence broke out there as well. Getting on here to point number 4 with Mr. Charles Sumner. Sumner's there on our bottom row of dignitaries to look at. But Charles Sumner is a senator from the state of Massachusetts. And Charles Sumner hated slavery, opposed it on so many levels. He really had an axe to grind with Southern culture and the Southern way of life. And they said that you could count on Charles Sumner to just get worked up every once in a while. Might happen a couple or 3 times a year. Where Charles Sumner would get so worked up that he'd stand there on the Senate floor and he'd start yelling and cussing and ranting against slavery. And in May of 1856, Charles Sumner was in a particularly bad mood. He took to the floor of the U.S. Senate, and in a big old rant, he was spitting, yelling, pounding the desk, and he was once again attacking slavery. In this tirade, he was talking about what was happening out in Kansas. And he kept pointing throughout his tirade at one senator in particular, this fellow named Andrew Butler on the bottom right-hand side of our slide. Butler comes from Georgia. He's a pro-slavery senator, been there for decades in the U.S. Senate. And Charles Sumner kept pointing his finger at Butler and saying, the blood of Kansas is on your hands, sir. You are a part of the slave power, and on he would go. And he's cussing and yelling at Butler, saying you're responsible for those who have died. Butler, for his part, just kind of sat there smiling. He wasn't really too upset. He would just kind of make the crazy symbol, like, yeah, what are you going to do? This guy's crazy, But people who were there that day on the floor of the Senate said that Butler really wasn't that upset about what Sumner had to say. The problem is Sumner has attacked a Southern gentleman, attacked his honor and his reputation. And these Southern gentlemen have kinfolk that'll come out of the woodwork. And there's a fellow named Preston Brooks, who is a cousin of Andrew Butler's. And Preston Brooks doesn't think it's funny. Preston Brooks, first of all, doesn't like that his family's honor has been attacked. But he also doesn't like the fact that the South itself has been attacked by Charles Sumner. Preston Brooks was a congressman from Georgia in the House of Representatives. He's a cousin of Butler's. So Brooks is in the lower house. These other 2 boys are up in the Senate. All right, well, a couple of days after Sumner gave his fiery speech, Preston Brooks walked into the Senate floor, the Senate chamber. He walked over to where Charles Sumner was sitting at his desk getting ready for the day's events. And without saying a word to anyone, Preston Brooks pulled a walking stick out and commenced to hitting Charles Sumner across the head, repeatedly striking him in the head, to the point that Charles Sumner falls to the ground. He's knocked unconscious. Charles Sumner would have scars across his forehead for the rest of his life over this. And, there were some senators from the North who tried to run and tackle Brooks, tried to break it up. Southern senators got in their way and said, now hold on just a minute, let's let these boys settle it out. But eventually a crowd did break through. They did tackle Brooks to the ground. It's a good thing, too, because Brooks didn't stop. He just kept hitting Sumner across the head. Probably would have killed him if they hadn't broke it up. But this was a very telling event. We've got people dying in Kansas, and now we've got bloodshed on the floor of the Congress. We've got men being beaten violently over the institution of slavery. In the aftermath of this, you can see that cartoon at the top right-hand side. Northerners were very upset about this. Here you can see the cartoon says Southern Chivalry, Argument versus Clubs. And people up north said, you can't say anything about slavery. If you do, the South, their response isn't to talk, it's to just hit you upside the head to try to kill you. You can't really debate anything with these people, they're just savages. So the North was upset about this physical punishment doled out to Charles Sumner. Southerners, though, felt very, very differently about this. Southerners said it's about time someone knocked some sense into those Yankee heads. Preston Brooks was removed from Congress. Sorry, you beat somebody like that, you're going to get removed. But Preston Brooks started receiving walking sticks in the mail, and they were engraved with things like "Give 'em hell, hit 'em harder, way to go." So Southerners were quite happy with what Preston Brooks did here. That all he was trying to do was knock some sense into those Yankee heads. So I'm going to go out on a limb and say it's getting pretty crazy in our country over all this. We got heads getting hacked off in ritualistic styles in Kansas. We got a warfare that's breaking out. We got people being beat across the head on the Senate floor. Senators after this beating, they started showing up with six-shooters, for real. They had on gun belts and everything with six-shooters. Their attitude was, ain't nobody going to beat me with an inch of my life. They come for me, I'm gonna defend myself. So yeah, things are getting really out of control in the country and the Congress over the institution of slavery. Well, all of that is the backdrop for the election of 1856. What's happening in Kansas? This warfare, this hardening of hearts over the institution of slavery. All of that is the backdrop for the election of 1856. All right, this is the first campaign where the Republican Party will have a nominee for president. And the man that they'll choose in 1856 is Mr. John Fremont, who technically at this moment is living in California. But Fremont, he's all over the place. He was a trailblazer. He was a explorer. He was in the U.S. military during the Mexican-American War. But he's really sort of known as this Western type guy, this explorer who had been out in the West and things like that. Well, John Fremont, in running for the Republican Party in 1856, he had a certain platform, if you will, things that he's going to run for. And this platform, though it won't work in 1856, it's going to be adopted by Abraham Lincoln in 1860, and it's going to win 4 years later. So let's look at what Fremont stood for here in 1856. Okay, John Fremont says that he's for industry. He believes that the federal government should do what it can to help factories grow, to help the Industrial Revolution take off. So he is for industry. Let's see, he is also for railroads. He believes we need to lay more track. We need more than just a transcontinental railroad. We need several of them. So he still stands for railroad. He stands for industry. He also stands for banks, financial institutions. He stands for Wall Street and believes that the government should do what it can to help our banks be solid and strong. Let's see, so far, industry, railroads, banks. He stands for a high protective tariff. We need to raise the rates on foreign products. That'll help protect jobs right here in the United States. Never mind the retaliatory tariffs and the problems. He stands for a high protective tariff. He also stands for the Homestead Law. He believes that we should have free land for free labor out to the West. He stands for the Homestead Law as well. And he also said that he opposed the Kansas-Nebraska Act. John Fremont said that though he did not oppose slavery in the states, he would not allow slavery to spread out west into the territories. And that really is like the fundamental concept of the Republican Party at this time. The states can keep the slaves, but they will not allow slavery to expand out into the West. All right, so we talked before about a Liberty Party, if you'll recall. The only issue it really talked about was, hey, we hate slavery. Then we got into a Free Soil Party with Van Buren. They stood for a little bit more, right? They said, Wilmot Proviso, we don't want any slavery in the land acquired in the war with Mexico. and they also stood for the Homestead Law. Well, this new thing called the Republican Party is going to champion some of those ideas. But really, the brilliance of a Republican Party is they appeal to Northern voters with their pocketbooks, with money. If you stand for industry and the growth of factories, that's more jobs. If you're living up north, you want a job, that's a good thing right there. I'm going to vote for this party because they're going to help expand some more factories, more jobs. They're about building railroads. There's more jobs too. They stand for banks. That helps economic prosperity. Let's see, they stand for a protective tariff. That's going to protect my job up here in the north. And they think that people should have access to free land out west, free soil for free labor. That's an appeal to the Northwest directly right there. And oh, yeah, they're not out to destroy slavery, right? They're not crazy like those radical abolitionists. They just don't want to see it spread out to the West. And, personally, I think Congress has the right to stop the spread of slavery, so I don't see any problems with this stance. And really, what the Republican Party was doing was appealing directly to the voters of the North. They didn't even try to get any Southern votes. They knew that it was a waste of time. So this Republican Party was an all-North party. And they're trying to convince the workers of the North that they are the party that will help them in their pocketbooks. And oh, by the way, it's almost an afterthought. We just don't want to see slavery spread out to the West. Money, economics, jobs. And oh, yeah, we just don't want to see slavery spread on out there to the West. All right, well, that's where Fremont stands here in 1856. The Democrats will go with James Buchanan as their nominee. And James Buchanan was the no-nonsense law and order candidate. He said he stood by the Constitution. He said whatever was law, it should be enforced. And hey, he said if that vote in Kansas was upheld by the government, that's got to be enforced. If the law says that Kansas is a slave territory, that's got to be enforced. So he's saying that the law is what's going to save us. Sticking to the Constitution is what's going to save our Union. So Americans were a little scared in 1856. They went with the no-nonsense law and order kind of guy in James Buchanan. You can see there on that election map to the top right, that's a lot of blue coming out of that map. So Buchanan wins. He will be the Democrat who wins the presidency here in 1856. And, Republicans, it sucks to lose, but they looked at the outcome of the election, and they started to realize that something great could happen down the road. And looking at this election outcome, Republicans said to themselves, if we could just get the free states of our union to vote for us, we could capture the presidency without a single Southern vote. Particularly what they need is Pennsylvania, Indiana, and Illinois. Again, looking at that map, they need those three states to turn red, to turn Republican, and they could carry it. So they said to themselves, forget about the South, just concentrate on the North, really put a lot of pressure on Pennsylvania, Indiana, and Illinois, switch over to us. So the Republican Party realized after this election that they could capture the White House and the majorities in the Congress, at least in the House anyway, if they just concentrated on the northern free states. Well, Southerners saw this too, and the Southern reaction to this election was to say, thank God Buchanan won. But also Southerners began to realize that those Republicans were right. That in the future there might be a man who wins the presidency who is Republican and doesn't owe them anything, doesn't stand for any of their values. And as crazy as this sounds, after this election of 1856, Southerners began to say that if a Republican should ever win the White House, it was time for them to secede and leave the country. Well, as it turns out, in the next campaign, a Republican will win the White House. And it also turns out they weren't bluffing. After Abraham Lincoln wins the presidency in November of 1860, very shortly after that, the South starts to secede and leave the Union altogether. So this election of 1856, Buchanan does win, but they understood. Sorry, Bonnie's having a rough day here. My puppy girl, Bonnie. But Southerners understood going forward that a Republican might win the presidency, And yeah, if that happened, it was time to secede. It was time to walk away. As early as 1856, Southerners were saying that. All right, well, James Buchanan, for his part, when we look back on it all, a lot of people believe that James Buchanan is the worst president that this country's ever had. I think that's a bit harsh of a statement to make. But what happens here with Buchanan is he really doesn't do anything. As the country falls apart, he says he's powerless to stop it. When the South begins to secede, he's still president when that happens. Lincoln won't come in until March of 1861. But as the South secedes, Buchanan says, I can't stop it. There's nothing I can do. And what we say is Buchanan just left this horrible mess that Lincoln had to clean up. It's kind of crazy if you think Buchanan's the worst we've ever had. And there's a lot of people who will agree with you that he's the worst president ever. It's kind of crazy that the country went from possibly the worst president to arguably the best president in the next campaign, right? You go from Buchanan to Abraham Lincoln. But yeah, that's probably not too fair of an assessment. But I know that Buchanan's not remembered very fondly when you list and compare your presidents of the United States. All right, well, one major event that happened whilst Buchanan was president of the United States is the Dred Scott decision. This is a huge case that's handed down, that's argued for and then decided upon by the U.S. Supreme Court. So let's look at this Dred Scott case, the decision, how things play out. But Dred Scott, there on the bottom of our slide, let's see, 1, 2, 3, third picture there. Dred Scott was a slave, and his owner lived near the city of St. Louis, Missouri. And back in the early 1820s, Dred Scott's owner, who was a doctor in the Army, he was an officer, and he was a surgeon, a doctor, if you will. But Dred Scott's owner, an officer in the U.S. Army, was called to duty. He was told to report to a military base up in what they called Minnesota. It wasn't even a territory at that time. It was just this unorganized part of the country up there. But Dred Scott's owner goes up to this military base in Minnesota, takes Dred Scott with him as his personal valet, his slave. And yeah, this master took his slave north of 3630. Took him into the territories north of 3630, where slavery is prohibited. It's against the law. There's no slavery north of 3630 in those territories. I know you're going to find this shocking, but this man violated the law. People violate the law every day, everywhere, right? There are hundreds of other stories of slaves taken north of 3630 as well. So that's one aspect of this story, is that Dred Scott was taken north of 3630, even though it was illegal to have a slave north of 3630 up there in the territories. All right, well, fast forward our story many years later. Dred Scott's owner dies. The owner of Dred Scott, the wife, the Army officer's wife, she inherits all of his property. The land, the home, the horses, all of it, and yes, the slave, Dred Scott. But this lady who now owns a slave, she's having misgivings about the institution. She's not sure which side of it all she leans on. By this time we've had a compromise of 1850. The country's going through all this bitter division over the institution of slavery. And at some point, the lady who owns Dred Scott, she has lunch with some friends of hers over in Illinois. It's just right across the river there. She's in St. Louis. She's got friends over on the Illinois side. She's having lunch. She's talking to them. And at some point in their conversations, all of this comes up. She now owns a slave. Her husband had taken this slave north of 3630 back in the day. And in this whole conversation, her friends, sort of a light bulb comes on. They start to get an idea. And they say, now, hold on. Let's think about this. What if we could get a lawyer who could represent your slave and argue that he should be freed on the grounds that he was taken north of 3630? What if we could get a judge to say that Dred Scott should be freed on the grounds he was taken north of 3630? Not only does that have the potential to free hundreds of other slaves, now I didn't say it would end slavery. Don't write that in your notes. That'd be a false statement. What I'm saying is, if Dred Scott could get his freedom on the grounds he'd been taken north of 3630, that could free hundreds of other slaves with a similar backstory, the ones who had been taken north of 3630 as well. So it has the potential to free hundreds of slaves, not thousands, not millions, but hundreds. But really, when the lawyers started to look into this and they agreed to take on the case, the lawyers were willing to fight for that. But more than anything, what they were thinking about is these lawyers wanted to argue the validity of the 3630 line. And what these lawyers were hoping was a federal judge would reinstitute the 3630 line and say that it was binding and that it was legal. If they could get a judge to say that, then it undoes the Kansas-Nebraska Act. It undoes the concept of popular sovereignty in Kansas and Nebraska. And that's really what the lawyers were looking for more than anything else. So this lady who owns Dred Scott, she was thinking about freeing him. She holds on to him, not because she wants to hold on to a slave, but because as long as he is a slave, that's the whole point of this case, is he's suing for his freedom. So she holds on to him as a slave. The lawyers get involved, and they will fight in court for Dred Scott being freed on the grounds that he was taken north of 3630 and that the Missouri Compromise line is legal, valid, and should be put back into place. All right, well, this case started out in St. Louis. It got appealed through city, county, state level courts. It eventually got appealed into the federal courts. And it will eventually come before the law of the land, the U.S. Supreme Court, in 1856. And who should be Chief Justice of the court at that moment? But our friend Roger Taney. You might remember him of Jackson fame. He's the guy who became Secretary of the Treasury and agreed to remove the deposits from the Bank of the United States. You recall I told you that after John Marshall passed away, Jackson made this guy Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So here Taney sits decades later on the court. He's from Maryland. The majority of the judges on the court were themselves from the South. And if the whole point of this case was to possibly free Dred Scott and have 3630 reinstituted, the whole thing blew up in their face like a hand grenade. And the situation's actually worse after the Dred Scott case than it had been before. All right, here's the decision that Taney and the majority handed down in the Dred Scott case. There's a lot to this case. I'm just going to break it down into these two decisions. Number one, Taney and the court said that people of African descent, so African Americans, if you will, but people of African descent are not citizens of a state or the United States. Decision number one, people of African descent are not citizens of a state or the United States. Therefore, they have no rights. In English, what the court is saying here is African Americans have no rights at all. They don't have any rights under state law, under federal law. So people of African descent are not citizens of a state or the United States. Therefore, they have no rights. Essentially, this case is being thrown out because Dred Scott doesn't have the right to sue for his freedom. He's not a citizen. He doesn't have the right to sue for anything. Okay, now in writing that down on your notes, I hope you're writing all this down in your notes, you did not write down the word slave. You just wrote down people of African descent have no rights. What happened is free people living up in the North woke up after the Dred Scott decision to find out that they had no civil rights. They were not citizens and they had no rights at all. Frederick Douglass, for example, wakes up in New York to find that he is not a citizen of the country in which he lives or the state in which he lives. And though he is free, he has no rights under the Constitution or the law of the state of New York. So this takes away the civil rights of people of African descent. free people living up north of African descent have no civil rights at all. That is a huge setback in things to come. Even when the Civil War is over with, the nation will be grappling with what is the status of the freed slaves, and Dred Scott will still be law. And at the end of the war, though there's freedom that comes, African Americans are still not citizens of a state of the United States, thanks to the Dred Scott case. We'll eventually get the 14th Amendment to rectify this problem, but that's a huge mess going forward. When the Taney Court said that people of African descent are not citizens of a state or the United States, therefore they have no rights. Dred Scott is not going to be freed by this case. Hundreds of other slaves with a similar backstory are not going to be freed by this case. There's point number one. Now, decision number two pertains to the 3630 line and whether or not it should be reinstated. And here's what the Taney Court has to say in decision number two. Let me know if you've heard this before. The court says that slaves are private property. The Constitution guarantees and protects private property. Therefore, as a citizen of the United States, you should be allowed to take your slave property into the territories as you please. I'm sure wherever he was, Calhoun was smiling from the grave, as the court essentially took his words and used them in defending this. But by saying that slaves are private property, the Constitution guarantees and protects private property. Therefore, you can take your slave properties with you to the territories out west. There never should have been a 3630 line, the court says. 3630 was illegal to begin with. In fact, you don't even need popular sovereignty votes anymore. All of the West, except for California, is now opened up to the possibility of slavery. Don't need no lines on a map. You don't need a popular sovereignty vote. All of the West, under the Dred Scott decision, is now opened up to the possibility of slavery. So this is a huge win for the South. I mean, for real, the South couldn't ask for anything more than what the Supreme Court gave them here in 1857. The case was heard in 1856. The decision was handed down after the holidays in 1857. So the South is very pleased with the Dred Scott case. Their feeling is, finally someone in that government stands up for us and our rights and what is right. So the South is overjoyed with the Dred Scott decision. But its real impact was felt in the North. This was just like a haymaker to the face for people living up north. They just really couldn't believe that the court had said that all of the territories out west were now opened up to slavery. Like, you don't even have to have a popular vote or any of that stuff. The West now belongs to slavery. And there were people up north who began to say, it just seems like every time this fight happens, the South gets everything that it wants. The South keeps winning in this fight on slavery. And people up north really started to believe in the slave power conspiracy. Now, they just said it was those crazy radical abolitionists who talked about how our government's been hijacked by the slave powers. But with the Dred Scott decision, it didn't sound so crazy anymore. And it really didn't sound like a conspiracy anymore, as slavery was now going to be allowed to spread all across the West out into the territories. So people up north got angry. And they said, I'm tired of the South always winning these fights. And they said, what I really want is the federal government to stand for us and stand for what we believe. The whole point of democracy is majority rule. There's 21 million people living in the North at this time. Down to the South, there's 11 million people living down South. And of that 11 million, 4.5 million are enslaved. So you can just look at raw numbers and say that the North outnumbers the South 2-1. And then if you look at those real numbers down South, it's really more like the North outnumbers the South 3-1, at least in terms of free population. So it didn't make sense to a lot of folks up north that the South always won, always got what it wanted, even though there was at least 2 to 3 times the population up north as there was down south. So people up north said, I want my government back. I want my government to stand for me and for my values. And I'm tired of the South winning all the time. The Democratic Party was not going to give you your government back. It was too controlled by the South. It was too in deep with the South. Again, look at that 1856 election map. That's a very solid South behind the Democrats and Buchanan. The Democratic Party is the party for slavery. It defends the institution. But here are these guys calling themselves Republicans. They're all about industry and railroads and banks. They're for a high tariff and homesteads. And hey, these guys, they're not out to destroy slavery down in the southern states. They just don't want to see it spread out west into the territories. So that Dred Scott decision did more for the Republican Party's cause than any speech or check they ever got. It really did convince people in Pennsylvania, Indiana, and Illinois to vote Republican in the next campaign. Abraham Lincoln, the best thing he got in terms of support for his election in 1860 was the Dred Scott decision and the anger that the North felt over the Dred Scott decision. By the way, when we look back on Supreme Court decisions of the past, most people agree this is the worst decision that the court ever handed down. A lot of people in today's world, when they don't like a decision by the court, they call it a Dred Scott decision, which is basically saying it's a horrible decision. But it stayed as law. It was there with the handing down of Taney in the majority. By the way, just real quick, to finish out our story here, Dred Scott, when the case was over with, he was granted his freedom anyway. His owner freed him. He lived as a free man to the day he died. He worked at a hotel in St. Louis as a baggage guy. So yeah, he got his freedom after this was all over with anyways. All right, well, as it turns out, there was the emergence of a politician who could give the people of the North their government back to them, a man who could stand up to the slave power conspiracy. So let's look at the emergence of Abraham Lincoln. Now, in looking at his early career, early life, he's born in Kentucky, which was a slave state, by the way. He grew up around slavery. But the Lincolns were dirt poor farmers trying to scratch out a living. They couldn't afford slaves. So Lincoln himself never did own slaves. But he was born in Kentucky, which was a slave state. By the way, about 30 miles down the road from where Lincoln was growing up, Jefferson Davis was also born in Kentucky, just a few miles down the road. The difference is the Davises were rich. They had a lot of slaves. They eventually packed up out of Kentucky and moved off to Mississippi later on down the road. So anyway, Lincoln did grow up around slavery. He saw it with his own eyes. But growing up in Kentucky, I guess he just kind of accepted it as a way of life, that this is how things were, I hate to make this statement, but it's true. For a good chunk of his life, especially early on, he did believe in the concept of black inferiority. In fact, he is quoted as saying as a younger man that if the slaves were ever freed, he said it would spark a race war in which white Americans would outnumber and overtake black Americans, and that they would be slaughtered, they would be killed. So he felt that freedom for the slaves would trigger a race war earlier in his life. Eventually, his family moves off to Indiana, so he moves up north to a free state. His dad sucked at farming in Kentucky, and lo and behold, he sucked as a farmer in Indiana as well. Eventually, his father moved the family to Springfield, Illinois. Guess what? He sucked as a farmer there too. But by that time, Lincoln was old enough that he could sort of work. He could provide for his family as well, his brothers, sisters, things like that. Early on, Lincoln worked a lot of odd jobs. He was what we call a rail splitter. He could chop down logs. He worked on rail lines. Later, he worked on those boats that would go up and down the Mississippi River. He actually later said that was the greatest job he ever had in his life. He loved going up and down the river, working on those boats. Let's see, eventually he'll get into the dry goods store business, be a clerk, run a dry goods store. So he's kind of like, us in a way. I mean, growing up, I worked several different odd jobs, just trying to scratch out a living and get by. I'm sure as you're going to college, you're going to work a couple of these Joe Jobs along the way as well. But the real burning passion in the man's heart was the law. He wanted to be a lawyer. He wanted to study the law. His idol, his hero, by the way, was Henry Clay. He really wanted to be like Henry Clay. So Lincoln studied the law. He took the bar exam several times before he finally passed it. But then, once he had his law practice up and running, he turns out to be a really good lawyer. I mean, people talked about how he was a great public speaker. He was witty. He was funny. He had a way of connecting with a jury. And he's a really, really successful lawyer there in Springfield, Illinois. But there was another fire that burned in his heart, just as strong as that of the law, and it was politics. And he really wanted to be a politician. Like Clay, right? Clay had started out as a lawyer, became a politician. Lincoln wanted to follow in those same footsteps. When he ran for public office, he ran as a Whig. But the only political contest he ever won was in 1860 for president and in 1864 in his reelection bid. He lost every other political contest he was ever involved in. The only time he really served in a political capacity was in 1846. A friend of his had just won a seat to the U.S. House of Representatives, but this friend got sick. He wasn't going to be able to travel to Washington to fulfill his post. And this guy asked the good people of Illinois to choose Lincoln to replace him, to be the guy to send that way. They honored the request of the guy they voted for. Lincoln's picked as his replacement and goes to Congress. And what a time to be in the House of Representatives. The United States declares war on Mexico in May of 1846. Lincoln is there for the vote for the war, the vote for funding, all of that stuff. So that's the only time he really served in a political capacity. In 1848, he doesn't get elected to the seat. He's bounced out. And by 1850, Lincoln had retired from politics. He'd had enough of losing. He was tired of wasting his money and his time on a losing effort. So Lincoln was resigned to being a country lawyer outside of Springfield, Illinois, handling cases, making good money. And he would have had a better life if that had been his life. Would have spent a heck of a lot more time with his wife and kids for sure. But then, in 1854, Kansas-Nebraska Act gets passed. He's so outraged and angered by passage of that law that it re-energizes him to get back into politics. He wants to go against Stephen Douglas, who is also from Illinois. So, yeah, it re-energizes Lincoln to go after Douglas, to go after the legislation. He becomes a Republican once that party is up and running. And Lincoln, the Republican, will go after Douglas, the Democrat, in things to come. Now, his stand on slavery and race is often eye-opening to students. But here it is. He really, for most of his life, thought that slavery was the natural course of things. And he really, for a good chunk of his life, believed in the white supremacy and black inferiority, as did, I would argue, probably 85% of the white male population at that time. They just believed it was a scientific fact that this is the way it is. You can call him a racist for most of his life. That's a true statement. It really is. But another great thing about Abraham Lincoln is he was able to admit when he was wrong. And in becoming president of the United States and in coming to understand that slavery was the problem, he changed his stance on the issue and on race. I also credit Frederick Douglass for a lot of this. Lincoln met with Douglass, and Frederick Douglass changed his mind, his attitude about black inferiority. You have the right, by the way, as a human being, to change your mind. You don't have to just doggedly, like a donkey, like a stubborn mule, stick to something just because you don't want to be proven wrong. The definition of being intelligent is being presented with facts and making your decisions based on those facts. And if facts that you're presented with cause you to change your mind, be adult enough to admit that you were wrong and change your mind. That's what Lincoln did. He had enough courage and fortitude to admit that he was wrong and change his mind. I mean, look, this is the guy who goes on to be the great emancipator. This is the guy who goes on to ask for African Americans to serve in combat in the Union Army. This is the guy who, before he was assassinated, was openly talking about extending the right to vote to African Americans who had served in the Union Army, and then working from there for further voting rights for others. All right, well, in 1858, Lincoln decides to run for the Senate seat out of Illinois that is occupied by Stephen A. Douglas. Douglas is going for a re-election, and Lincoln is challenging him for that Senate seat. At first, Douglas did not want to debate Lincoln at all. Douglas knew, look, this is a lock. I'm going to be reelected. There's no reason for all this mess. And Douglas refused to meet with Lincoln to debate him in public. I figured there was nothing he could gain from that event. But then as Douglas went across the state of Illinois to try to talk to the voters, every stop he went to, there was Lincoln sitting in the front seat with a big old crazy top hat on. And Lincoln would shout at him, interrupt his speech, challenge him on points that he had made. And then finally, at some point, Douglas walked out on the stage, and sure enough, there's Lincoln again. He realizes what's about to happen. So before Douglas begins his speech, he looks at Lincoln and says, tell you what, if I agree to debate you, will you allow me to talk, say what I need to say? And Lincoln said, that's fine by me. I'll allow you to speak and say what you have to say, if you'll allow me to say what I have to say. So the two men meet and agree to hold these debates across the state of Illinois. They sat down and came up with the rules for what is forever known as the Lincoln-Douglas style of debate. And basically in this, what happens is you allow the first person to stand up and speak. You don't interrupt them. You don't challenge them. They get to say what they got to say. Then they sit down, and it's your turn to speak. It's your turn to say what you have to say. Then the first person gets back up, and they can challenge the things that you've said. They can sort of ask you questions. It's like a cross-examination type thing. The other person can do the same. So the Lincoln-Douglas style of debate was born here so that these men could say what they wanted to say and have a chance to challenge each other on the points that they had made. All right, well, using this debate style, these two men go across the state of Illinois. And there's this one moment in the campaign. I don't want to go into everything. We'll look at what happened in this one city, Freeport, Illinois. There was a big moment that happened here in these debates. Lincoln came out in Freeport, Illinois. He got to speak first, and he came out guns a-blazing. He is going after Stephen Douglas as the architect of Kansas, Nebraska. He's saying that Douglas is part of the slave power conspiracy that has hijacked our government. So he's painting this picture of Douglas as pro-slavery, in with the slave powers. He is responsible for all the carnage and mayhem out there in Kansas. All right, well, when it's Douglas's turn to stand up and say what he has to say, he's going to issue what will forever be known as the Freeport Doctrine. And that's something you'll want to write down. Douglas's response in Freeport, Illinois, is the Freeport Doctrine. And Douglas says, under the Freeport Doctrine, he says, I myself have never owned a slave, nor do I ever want to own a slave. But who am I to deny another man that constitutional right? So in Freeport, Illinois, Douglas is saying, I'm not a part of this slavery thing. I don't own slaves. I don't want to own slaves. But I'm not going to interfere with another man exercising his constitutional right to own slave property. That response by Douglas in Freeport, Illinois, played well with the crowd. It actually played well with the voters throughout Illinois. So that Douglas does go on to win that Senate seat. Here's another loss for Lincoln, the Senate campaign of 1858. But the thing is, this debate, as it tore across Illinois, it made national headlines. People in the North and the South were reading about what each of the candidates had to say. And what we say about the Senate race of 1858 is it made Abraham Lincoln famous. It made him someone that all of America was paying attention to, whether you like slavery or not. And really running for the Senate seat and making his stand against slavery in 1858, it's what's going to propel him to the Republican nomination in 1860, which then is going to propel him on into the White House. Some historians put it like this. Douglas may have won a Senate seat here in 1858, but Lincoln won the presidency in many ways in 1858. Because see what Douglas said in Freeport? I don't own slaves, I don't want to. Who am I to deny another man that right? That's not a full-on endorsement of the institution of slavery. And when Southern Democrats are looking for a nominee in 1860 for president, they're looking for someone who's 100% committed to the cause. And what Douglas had said at Freeport wasn't a 100% dedication to the cause. Douglas kind of hurt himself in his chances in 1860 for the presidency. All right, well, sectionalism continued to rise throughout the latter part of the 1850s. There's a gentleman named William Seward. You can see him there on the bottom left-hand side of our slide. William Seward was the leading Republican of that time. He was the most famous Republican at that time. And William Seward just continued to criticize the South as evil and immoral, continued to attack it every chance he got. And there were a lot of people who believed that William Seward would be running for president in 1860, that he would be the nominee of the Republican Party in that 1860 campaign. But the more he attacked the South, the more angry they got. And look, the South had already said, if a Republican wins the White House in 1860, it's time to secede. And now the South began to say, if it's that knucklehead Seward, we can't leave fast enough. So the more he attacked, the more he just pushed the South, enraged them, angered them. And just, they keep getting that feeling that if a Republican wins the White House, it really is time to leave, especially if it's a guy like William Seward. All right, now this federal slave code for the territories is a big moment as well. Put a star, rainbow, or a smiley face by that. Federal slave code for the territories works like this. So the Supreme Court has already said yes to slavery out west. You got the Dred Scott decision, right? It opens up the West to slavery. Well, what Southerners want is for the other two branches of the government to agree with that. And the federal slave code for the territories was this idea that Congress would pass a law saying, yes, you can take your slaves out west of the territories, and they want the President of the United States to sign that into law as well. So they've already got the Supreme Court, the judicial branch, saying yes to slavery out west. Federal slave code for the territories was this idea of Congress, the legislative branch, and the President, the executive branch, agreeing with that, so that all three branches of the government at that point would agree that you can take your slaves out west into the territories. The Democratic Party in particular was going to have a bit of a tough challenge with this. Northern Democrats in particular had a tough time with this federal slave code. Southern Democrats wanted it, supported it all the way. They were demanding that their Northern Democratic allies do the same. But a guy like Stephen Douglas, for example, who's kind of getting ready to run for president in 1860, Stephen Douglas says, hey, look, we're already going to have our hands full in this 1860 campaign. If I come out and endorse this federal slave code for the territories, I'm going to lose a lot of Northern votes and support. I can't do that. So Northern Democrats were begging Southern Democrats to stop agitating, to stop asking for this. Northern Democrats said, look, you got the Dred Scott decision. That's all you need. Southern Democrats didn't care. They wanted to hear Congress and President say, yes, you can take your slaves with you out west into the territories. All right, well, in the 1850s, in spite of a compromise, the Union continues to divide. Boy, Stephen Douglas just unleashed a hornet's nest of problems with his Kansas-Nebraska Act. And you can see sectionalism continues to rise. And the 1850s will end with a bang. You'll see that here in just a second when we get into our next topic and look at John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry.